Hey, wealth builders. Simon Dixon here, and welcome to Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 20. This is where we discuss hard talk about hard money. I've been obsessing over the subject of money for the last 2 decades on Bitcoin investing and money. And today we're going to do the same as usual. The first half, we're going to be giving all the updates this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, this week in geopolitics, how the intersection happens, so that you can prepare for a world of Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies that I've been predicting since I published the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin and transition to CBDCs in 2011, before CBDCs was a word. And Bitcoin is the protector, the proof of work network that protects you from the atrocities of the fiat currency proof of weapons network. And we're sharing this journey together. So without further ado, we're going to jump straight in. And the second half that we're going to be covering is a little bit of history. So the first half is all current news. And the second half is where we cover history to help you understand the current news, because the more history you understand, the more you're able to make sense. The more you're able to make sense of today's world, the better you are at building and protecting your wealth so that you can contribute more to all the problems that we're experiencing in the world right now. And that is my goal for you. So without further ado, let's jump straight into what was happening this week in Bitcoin. So the alleged founder and creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, is obviously the real creator of Bitcoin. We don't know who they are, whether it was a divine intervention, whether it was a group of people, whether it was a bunch of hackers. Many people speculate, but still to this day, no one knows who created Bitcoin. But there is one guy that claims to be the creator of Bitcoin, and he is currently in court in the UK, and he is on his fifth day in court, which ended today. We should know the outcome of this one, but he is being exposed. And I'm not going to say anything because he's going around and suing everybody and putting them in frivolous court cases for basically proving what is being proven in court right now. Forged loads of documents, lots of stuff that is being alleged in court right now. And Copper was an alliance that was put together to protect the intellectual property behind Bitcoin, because this mofo decided that it would be a good idea to start creating his own version of Bitcoin, a shitcoin called Bitcoin SV, where there's only basically two miners, and Calvin Ayre and Craig Wright himself. And then, say that he's going to use intellectual property to try and legally challenge all of the developers behind Bitcoin. What a crazy thing. But what this does is it proves one more anti-fragile attack on Bitcoin to prove itself. And let's see what happens. So Copper is a group of people that are basically fighting him in court to protect the intellectual property behind Bitcoin. It's on its fifth day, and probably we'll cover the outcome of the court case next week. So basically, the whole week was him proving that he forged a bunch of documents, and there was Google Docs that were created after the creation of Bitcoin that he said was evidence that he created Bitcoin before Bitcoin, and all sorts of crazy stuff. So that was a little bit of entertainment. It's been entertaining in our industry for quite some time. I think we'll find out by February the 13th. So where are we right now? I think we're at about the 8th. So we'll find out the outcome, and we'll make sure we give that update on Bitcoin Hard Talk. And so what else have we got? There was a little bit of attack on Bitcoin mining. So proof of work in America. For those of you that don't know the history, most of the mining used to happen in China. It now happens really distributed around the world, but a big industry emerged in Texas, America, where people are using renewable energy, all sorts of energy, in order to repurpose electricity into the grid to power Bitcoin's proof of work network. And because when China implemented a ban, and we learned that Bitcoin survives even when the second, or some would call the largest economy in the world, ends up, attacking Bitcoin, that nothing happens. People relocate to another location, and then a bunch of people went over to the US, and so a US market emerged, and many of those Bitcoin miners went public, and they're publicly tradable on NASDAQ. But the Biden government today decided to launch something. What is it called? The key elections, and decided to launch something in order to get a bunch of data from Bitcoin miners. That will probably be disputed, but we're going to watch that one and see what actually happens. They actually sent an emergency collection of, what did we call it? Let's look at the notes. Okay, so they had basically a data request related to all the power consumption of Bitcoin miners, and they'll probably use an ESG narrative. Now, the interesting about ESG, environmental social governance, is it was created by Larry Fink, and Larry Fink essentially messaged out to all of the different shareholdings behind much of the companies where people were pooling together through his ETFs and various other funds, and said that they're going to start scoring people, whether they invest in them, based upon environmental considerations, social considerations, and governance considerations as well. But also, BlackRock is obviously now the largest Bitcoin ETF, as we've been covering on Bitcoin Hard Talk. So obviously, we'll probably start to see whether Larry Fink tries to put some influence in there. And because there's a buoyant mining industry in America, maybe they'll start looking at more renewable innovation, which is actually happening right now. And Bitcoin mining just gets better and better and better as it gets more and more innovative in order to adjust in this anti-fragile network that for 14 to 15 years, people have been trying to take down, but it never, ever gets taken down and just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So really, this might be another way for the US to impose regulations upon Bitcoin. It's an interesting proposition because essentially people purchase machines and it spits out Bitcoin, and then you can invest in these companies on the NASDAQ stock market, and it repurposes energy, taking energy away from central banking and the proof of weapons network, and essentially eats away at the proof of weapons network. To help you understand that, the current Bitcoin market cap is about $800 billion right now, and the price has been going up more recently, as it normally does, heading into halving. Halving is where every 4 years, the number of Bitcoins that get created every 10 minutes, rewarding miners that verify transactions on the network that allows it to operate without a bank and without a central bank, they half, and then you tend to get a bit of an effect when there is this supply shock of Bitcoin and it contracts, and then the price goes up because miners start getting more and more efficient, and we've had this 4-year cycle. In this year, in 2024, we get to see the impact of that, which normally happens, around about May is when we'll May, June, wherever we may see some of the impact from mining. It's normally priced into it. I don't recommend anybody trades on that, but it's currently, approaching $1 trillion a market cap. Gold is about $12 trillion a market cap. And even the proof of weapons network, if you take all of the different currencies, the major top fiat currencies in existence, that's about $164 trillion a market cap. So Bitcoin is now approaching about 0.6% of the entire market cap of every fiat proof of weapons currency that exists in the world today. And as we all know, the supply of fiat currency always goes up in a debt-based Ponzi scheme where you have to roll over the debt, which devalues the fiat currency, destroys people's savings, so they have to pay higher tax and they have to use debt. And if you're close to the central bank, then you get to borrow at 0%. But if you're a pauper, unfortunately, you're on the wrong side of debt and you have to borrow on a credit card to consume, and you pay about 30% debt. And so the proof of weapons network creates that rich-poor divide, and Bitcoin just does the opposite. Basically, anyone can purchase it, and it's Austrian economics on a blockchain rather than proof of weapons. Is Keynesian economics on a blockchain where the government goes deeper and deeper in debt to roll over the Ponzi scheme, to take on debt in order to build greater and greater military industrial complexes, which then end up blowing people up around the world, and you end up with civil wars, revolutions, external wars, and everything that we are currently experiencing right now, and having to create nuclear weapons, which we'll cover in the second half, in order to try and prevent people blowing each other up. And so that's scheduled to start anyway, a bit of a data collection exercise there. What else did we have? Oh, we had the $400 million hack of FTX. So when FTX went into bankruptcy, the fraudster Sam Bankman-Fried, which by the way is now sharing the same lawyer as the fraudster Alex Mashinsky, the $3 billion hole that he created for by persuading lots and lots of victims to put their lifetime savings in essentially a crypto bank. Teaching people the importance of owning your own keys and understanding how to use Bitcoin. But the FTX, when they went into bankruptcy, $400 million was immediately hacked from the exchange. There was lots of speculation that this was an inside job. What we have learned now, or what's been published by Elliptic, that's been doing some chain analysis, and the investigation that's coming, because there's an examiner in the bankruptcy, and SBF will be facing up to 115 years in his sentencing. And now Mashinsky's got 115 years, and now they even share the same lawyer. If you remember the famous quote in Breaking Bad, you don't need a criminal lawyer, you need a criminal lawyer. Well, Mashinsky and SBF now have the same criminal lawyer to protect them from their crime. Hopefully the cell token that Mashinsky used in order to perpetrate the crime doesn't put him in the same cell because he tried to sell his cell as SBF. We will see what happens. But in the FTX case, it turned out it was a SIM swap. So for those of you that don't know, when you're protecting your digital assets and your Bitcoin, you and everything, in fact, including your email, you should have two-factor authentication. You shouldn't be using SMS text messages. Why? Because hackers can find a way of social engineering the telco companies and getting them to swap, getting your PAC code and get them to swap your SIM so that then they can unlock your account. Well, this hack occurred because one of the executives went through a SIM swap, which was the same thing that happened to the SEC recently. The SEC prematurely approved the ETF on Twitter, which caused a pump in the price of Bitcoin. It took it to about 47,000, around where it is right now, and that corrected it just before the real approval. So SIM swap lessons there. This led to the $400 million hack. And remember, when you steal crypto, you create immutable records on a blockchain, and that shit tends to come back to bite you when you steal money in the future. Now, it's currently being blamed on Russian criminal gangs and syndicates that are doing coordinated hacking and SIM swapping. And so it's not currently an inside job, is the latest intelligence. We'll see what happens there. And hopefully there could be some type of recoveries and arrests. We shall see. On the same time, the Genesis bankruptcy. So Genesis was another financial institution. We've covered it a lot on Bitcoin Hard Talk. It is currently seeking approval to sell $1.4 billion of GBTC. So remember, in previous broadcasts, we talked about GBTC. GBTC is a trust that allowed institutions, because the regulators couldn't figure out how to approve an ETF, which is a great product. And so this bad product called GBTC allowed people to get exposure to Bitcoin. It was ultra expensive. It used to depeg from the price of Bitcoin, creating the opportunity for people to arbitrage and make money by, by playing the differential in the price of the product to the price of the underlying. Well, now Genesis wants to sell $1.4 billion of GBTC, which takes it out. It means that you sell the shares, which means that when you sell the shares, now it's an ETF, you sell the Bitcoin, but at the same time, they want to buy Bitcoin at the same time. It's also the same with ETH. And so it should really be net neutral, but this is a shrinking of GBTC, and maybe that goes over to Bitcoin. And then they'll be applying in court in order to settle with Genesis. Genesis wants to settle with Gemini, who's the big dispute that's happening there that we've been covering all the way through. So basically, it's just going to be selling Bitcoin GBTC shares in order to buy Bitcoin and settle the dispute. We shall see what the impact of that is. What else have we got? So we've also got, there was a special purpose broker dealer approved. This is a financial institution that is treating ETH staking as a security. And this is going to be a dispute that will be resolved in the Coinbase case, which we'll keep covering. And the Coinbase case is where Coinbase is fighting the SEC to find out what the status of ETH staking is. In the meantime, there is an SEC-regulated broker-dealer that is classifying it as a security so that Americans can do ETH staking through a US-regulated broker-dealer. And we will see and track the outcome of that. BlockFi creditors. These were all the 2022 fraudulent companies that all went down because they were taking excessive leverage and repeating banking, but within the Bitcoin and crypto market. Well, BlockFi and Three Arrows Capital, they were all exposed to, you know, the Terra Luna. If you've watched previous episodes, they were essentially a pretend decentralized cryptocurrency that was creating stable coins. It blew up $60 billion between its token and its stable coin. Three Arrows Capital was exposed. It was a hedge fund that was exposed to both the GBTC trade when it went the wrong way around and Terra Luna. And they were borrowing from all these companies like Celsius and BlockFi and FTX. And FTX had its hedge fund Alameda. We wiped out all the bad actors, all the criminals. And they're all through their bankruptcies. And obviously creditors got on the wrong side of that. But BlockFi had a couple of unresolved cases. One was with the hedge fund, Three Arrows Capital. The other is with FTX. Now, those are about to be resolved, which means that BlockFi creditors are likely to get a higher recovery depending on the outcome. To help you understand it, BlockFi and 3AC, they had their debate. They basically withdrew money from each other, and one was claiming that they, wanted to settle different amounts. The judge decided that it's going to seal the details for now, so we'll find out a little bit later. But essentially, BlockFi wanted to get $129 million from 3AC, which would then be an addition to those BlockFi creditors, making sure they get a higher recovery. But 3AC at the same time, they wanted to countersue for $200 million because probably they were borrowing from BlockFi to take trades. They unwound the trade and then they were all interwoven amongst each other. Apparently, they have now reached a settlement that's good for creditors in BlockFi. Also, Celsius creditors, that's the one where I had a small amount. And remember, I've always been teaching. You have spending money, which is fiat on the Proof-of-Weapons Network. You have savings, which I use Bitcoin on the Proof-of-Work Network. And then I have a percentage of that, which I use for investments. And sometimes I was experimenting with borrowing against my Bitcoin rather than selling it. And I put a bunch of it on Celsius in order to experiment with that. I also wanted to see whether I could earn some yield on it to pay the interest. And I got wiped out on that trade. Fortunately, I risk managed. It was only a small percentage of my wealth. But for others, they had their whole thing in because they listened to Maszynski and put their lifetime savings on there. However, I ended up one of the top creditors. So I've been working on that case for the last 2 years. And interestingly, the VP head of loans is also now working for the Israeli Defense Force and used her opportunity. So Maszynski is facing up to 115 years in the US. But the co-founder, Daniel Leon, is using his right to and now is working with the president and the prime minister's office of Israel on an AI startup. And his wife or his partner actually now works for the IDF, head of digital marketing, to spread propaganda that actually led to all the defunding of UNRWA, which was the case, where people were defunding UNRWA, which was basically looking after refugees that were expelled from Palestine that don't have a right to return. Obviously, Israel wanted to make sure that they had their own United Nations organization so that the 7 million people that were expelled could never return to their land, whereas all other refugees after war, they're able to return to their land. And so Israel created their own United Nations division. And this is now getting defunded as a result of propaganda that was spread from the VP of Celsius, which was a $3 billion Ponzi scheme that spread propaganda leading to the defunding of refugees around the world. So that tells you the types of ethics of these interwoven geopolitical crypto Bitcoin scams and all sorts of stuff, which is happening. But always remember, Bitcoin owned by you is different to Bitcoin held at a fake bank. But anyway, Celsius has started paying out those distributions. If you are a Celsius creditor, I did a webinar last night. Head over to simondixon.com/recovery. You can get access to that webinar and how to calculate what you're getting and how to make sure that you get everything else you are entitled to, because we're also taking all the fraud, getting rid of the fraud, and we're launching our own Bitcoin mining public company. And so we're going to be contributing to Proof of Work Network, and we are going to be adjusting to that. You need to get your shares and all sorts of stuff. Looking forward to contributing to my share of the Proof of Work Network. I'll be sharing updates as that progresses. What else have we got? Let me check out some of the notes. Right. Also, currently Ethereum on the proof of stake network, it just reached a milestone this week. Approximately 25% of ETH is now, of the entire network, is now staked. What does that mean? Those that stake it, they contribute their validators to the network. And when the way that it works that is different from proof of work, whereas, you know, miners and nodes is all more decentralized, those that hold ETH have a share of the network and the transaction fees as proof of stake works. And so about 25% of the network is now locked up staking, which means it is receiving its share of transaction fees. And what I do with my ETH staking is, while it powers DeFi and stable coins and central bank digital currencies, as those use case comes through, essentially the proof of weapons network is being disrupted into stable coins backed on a proof of stake network. And that proof of stake network pays out those transaction fees, and I use it in order to buy Bitcoin in the proof of work network. I covered more about Tether's business model in last week's Bitcoin Hard Talk as well, so that you can utilize the proof of weapons network, the proof of stake network, and the proof of work network in order to defund the proof of weapons network. Remember that $164 trillion of market cap I just talked about? Well, approximately 1% of it is approaching as Bitcoin grows through its halving cycles and eats away at the proof of weapons network. You can benefit from that. At Bank to the Future, the company that I co-founded, we've actually got our Ethereum staking solution that auto converts it into Bitcoin. We've got over 200 validators that have about 32 ETH. We're coming out of beta right now, but you might want to experiment whether that's right for you. That's what I'm doing in terms of my investment side. Remember, spending in the proof of weapons network, savings on the proof of work network, and investing through things like the proof of stake network in order to get more savings in the proof of work network that then allows you to spend more in the proof of weapons network. And then you can contribute more as more and more worldly events affects more and more people in this crazy transition we are going through. So that's everything I've got on the Bitcoin news. Now, in terms of the macro news, in the macro news, it was really dominated by China this week. China essentially is going into deflation, 0.8%. Now, if you remember, there used to be this thing in the proof of weapons network when fiat currencies were backed by gold and silver back in the good old days when they weren't ever expanding world's largest regulated Ponzi schemes. You used to have this thing called a market. And the way the market used to operate is every now and then when things got too heated, the prices will start coming down and you have disinflation or deflation. Now, America invented this system whereby markets aren't allowed to go down, real estate prices aren't allowed to go down, and you just always pay through ever inflation, wealth inequality, and you take on debt, which was copied from obviously the British system. The British system copied it from the Dutch system, which was all of the central banking proof of weapons network as we know them today when it first got created in 1694 with the foundation of the Bank of England. Well, China is going through disinflation. Now, those in the proof of weapons network that are used to always wanting quantitative easing, Ponzi schemes, roll over the debt until the whole thing gets hyperinflated, destruction when no one will buy those bonds because you end up with, like in America, almost $1 trillion of debt every year to service just in interest payments alone, where if you pay off that debt, the entire system collapses and immediately you have to roll it over. Well, China is going through disinflation right now, and everybody's like, China's over, China's over. As a result of that, now I am no fan of communistic ways of organizing an economy, but what I do like is the fact that they're allowing that to happen. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to continue. They're decreasing their bank reserves, and they're not. I don't know how big the stimulus they're going to do, and whether they're going to bail out the banks. But whatever happens, the proof of work network has been running and operating for 14 years, following the same cycle in this bull market with lots of volatility in between that wrecks the traders and transfers fiat proof of weapons network wealth over to the savers on the proof of work network, as we are experiencing in this transition. So China's going through about 0.8%. Now, what that does is it means that companies go bust and you allow the price of real estate to go down. What a concept. It makes it more affordable for those that can no longer afford real estate, other than those that are able to borrow at 0% from the central bank. And so disinflation or deflation is painful, but it's a market force. It's Austrian economics, and the Keynesians come along and say, no, 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 no. Real estate can't go down. You can't let property prices go down. You can't let stock markets go down. You have to use more and more communistic ways of organizing your economy, and you come up with quantitative easing, and you come up with manipulation of interest rates in order to get the banks to lend more, and you ask more and more people to take on more and more debt, and you roll it over and roll it over and roll it over until the whole thing comes into one ginormous, unsustainable mess where the cost of servicing the debt through a military industrial complex servicement is far too great. And then you end up with wars and change of empires and monetary renegotiations that I've been preparing for, that I believe we will see in our lifetime. Well, Hong Kong, where I used to live for about 5 years, they're trying to force it into liquidation and make sure that they're using more free market side of doing this, and we shall see. My guess is it will move over to more of the American communistic rollover economics and put it all on the PBOC bank's balance sheet. But remember what I've always forecasted: China looks more and more like America. America looks more and more like China, and they meet in the middle as the world battles for CBDCs, and those CBDCs can be backed by Bitcoin and other things. And we will have oppressive CBDCs competing with freedom-related CBDCs, and eventually we'll meet in the middle, and we end up with this incredible world that we are going to end up living in. You have the exit with the proof of work network, Bitcoin, the only one. And what did we see? Well, it led to about 30% of all stocks in China essentially being, halted as a result. So stocks normally halt when they crash too hard rather. The CSI index, the China index, essentially the top 1,000, it was down about 8% in a matter of hours as these announcements came out on the macro side. And what else have we got here? And basically over the last 30 days, the stock market was down 30%. PBOC, they cut the bank reserves in order to stimulate and do more free market way of intervening, but they're probably going to now launch a stimulus package and follow US way of not allowing that to happen, because they're all competing with each other. Ironically, when you have governments that don't change frequently, which are historically associated with more totalitarian, like Xi Jinping, Putin, but when you have governments that change every 4 years, you tend to be more associated with Ponzi economics, because in order to get votes, you have to fakely stimulate the economy. And for example, in El Salvador, Bukele just broke the trend and decided that even though in the constitution it has to change every 5 years, he got his second election to inspire his Bitcoin vision. Do with that whatever you do, whatever you say. I'm all for governments transitioning to the proof of work network, but remember, they have different shades of propaganda, which brings us into geopolitics before we start going to some nuclear history that brings us to exactly what we are experiencing today. So what did we see? All right, so US in the geopolitical side, it was trying to get votes for funding of Israel, funding of Ukraine, funding of Taiwan to get $100 billion, $95 billion out of America, which will pay for it through increased tax and inflation, over to blowing up people and defending wars. And so $95 billion is going to be going, it was meant to be going $61 billion to Ukraine. We had $17 billion over to Israel to perform the genocide. And by the way, today in geopolitics, they expelled 1.5 million Gazans into Rafah. And now they called it a safe zone, ask everyone to go there, expelled them from their homes. They're all experiencing famine and starvation. They're blocking humanitarian aid in. And now they're actually just striking at those in the so-called safe zone that they used to propagandize that this was the most ethical military in the world that the US is funding. And 9.1 billion then is meant to go into humanitarian aid, but a lot of it goes into Ukraine, and there's a little bit of it that's meant to be going into Gaza as well. And so at the same time, Trump is obviously going to be using, as we go into the 2024 election, that we need to protect the borders, which was his original campaign wall thing. And we're seeing crazy things being said by Biden during the Putin interview from Tucker Carlson. And so for those of you that don't know, look, here's the message that I have for you. Am I a big fan of Putin? Absolutely not. Every government engages in the Proof-of-Weapons Network, and they perform atrocities just like Putin. If you want to know that, look at what America and UK are doing in the Middle East right now. Humanitarian crisis in Yemen, in Syria, in Palestine, in Gaza, terrorists from Israel raiding into settlers, invading people's land in the West Bank, which has no association to the alleged, people that they're trying to perpetrate against at the moment, but they're using that opportunity to expand. And US has basically already spent $110 billion to replenish its supplies of weapons, going to the military industrial complex to pump its stock market so that it can replenish its weapons supplies in order to fund genocides that are experiencing, that they try to frame and use media propaganda. Now, does Putin do the same thing? Abso-freaking-lutely. But do not believe that that's the bad guys and we're the good guys, because that's the scam they want you all to believe. There is Islamophobia and anti-Semitism on the rise all around the world because they scammed everyone into believing that we're fighting each other in a religious war, when really it's an inevitable consequence of following the money on the Proof-of-Weapons Network that we can all exit through Bitcoin proof of work and eat away at it. So for those of you that say that's all propaganda, I'm amazed at how many people don't like freedom of speech anymore. They believe I would much rather hear the other side of the propaganda so that we can debate on Twitter Spaces. And by the way, I'm going to be trying something new at the end of this, just before I go the outcome of that, and then we go into the nuclear side and the geopolitical side. Do me a favor, if you're enjoying this video, it's rely upon you now. YouTube is not ranking us anymore because they don't like what we're saying. So hit the like button, that will help the algorithms. Hit the share button if you think other people should be making their own decisions on how to build and protect their wealth as the Proof-of-Weapons Network gets eaten away by the Proof-of-Work Network. And do me a favor, what are we going to do after this? I'm going to experiment with something new. If you have an account on simondixon.com, if you don't have one, go over to there right now, hit the button, and you can create, there's a membership site there. And we're going to do a webinar where you get to ask me questions. So if you've got questions, you can jump in there. The first 200 people that join, They can come up, they can ask some questions. It's a bit experimental. I don't think we've ever used the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. But for those of you that want to join us, we're going to be doing that. And then you can ask us some questions. And other times we've done this, it's been getting more and more popular. But the first 200 that join us, and we'll record it. Okay, awesome. All right, so back to the show. Yeah, so Putin did his interview with, Tucker Carlson. And for those of you that listen to it, I love history. I'm geeky. So I don't mind hearing his version of history and then comparing it to the US version of history and then comparing it to the UK version of history and meeting in the middle at what we believe to be the truth. And you probably come to the conclusion that all governments do propaganda and they do equal crimes. Now, Putin is particularly bad because he assassinates, journalists in his own country. But 100 journalists have been assassinated in Gaza, and that's been funded by US. So, America and US, we just, and UK, we don't blow up our own journalists, but we're more than happy to blow up other journalists and make sure it doesn't happen on our doorstep. But we get the retaliation that comes from this. So you decide which evil is better and worse, but it's why I love Bitcoin, because it allows me to save in a currency that's not politically connected to media propaganda in order to say we're the good guys and you're the bad guys. So if you watched it anyway, you get Putin's version of events. He talks about how the US rejected Russia wanting to negotiate peace and join NATO by Bill Clinton. You can hear his version of events there. He talks about the 2008 NATO expansion against Russia rather than going for peace. And the Minsky agreement that was meant to, that was an agreement that was reneged by NATO forces. He talks about, from his perspective, in Ukraine, there was a military coup funded by America in 2014 in Ukraine around those regions. And in 2022, it escalated. And Tucker Carlson was asking, well, why did you wait until 2022? Putin gave his version around how he thinks that there's neo-Nazism that was a hangover from previous wars. And I think it's interesting to hear other people's perspectives. You decide what's the propaganda, and probably you'll find that you're defending your own kind because you were brought up on a certain type of propaganda, just as the Russian people think they're the good people, and the Ukrainian people think they're the good people, and the UK people think they're the good people, and the American people think they're the good people. You find out that this is why politically a neutral proof of work is a beautiful thing that was sent down to us in order to have peaceful negotiations, according to Putin. That's his version of story. But he also said some of the trends that we covered last week on Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 19 around the Russian and Chinese, corridors and international trade as a result of some of those proof of weapons sanctions that essentially allowed Russia to prove its economy, even though $350 billion of foreign exchange reserves were wiped out. And now, rather than 3%, about 34% of their trade is clearing in the Chinese yuan, and BRICS is expanding. We now have, for example, I think he shared $230 billion of trade between Russia and China as a result of those sanctions. That is not an improvement if you want to work in this world where nuclear weapons are meant to protect yourself from escalations. Now, remember, also, we're seeing this whole foreign exchange reserves thing come up quite a lot. Those foreign exchange reserves, 350 billion from Russia, got deleted by the central bank or the Federal Reserve. Remember, also, Israel has $225 billion of its own exchange reserve, which is a rainy day fund, and yet it wants American taxpayers to pay for its genocide that we are watching happen in real time. You had the 350 billion sanctioned from Russia, but also remember, these were the same funds that were used in 2023 to stop people running on banks in America. The foreign exchange reserves is what backed the $650 billion of bad debt that is on banks' balance sheet right now, because the Fed did these bank BTLP. Remember, we covered that last week. bank term loans program. That expires in March. We get to see. And even Jerome Powell came out on an interview on 60 Seconds saying he expects more bank failures as a result of that. And remember, there was, different this Ukrainian and COVID money printing, as well as the Houthi attacks in Saudi Arabia as a result of the non-normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Caused a lot of this hyperinflationary cycle because of all the money printing that happened as a result of that. And those loans were what caused failures in the banking system when they had to increase rates and you had assets having to be sold at a discount while people were requesting withdrawals from their banks. And so we have in March the outcome of how those things are actually going to be doing that. And one more thing, before I start going through the second half on some of the nuclear funding, remember that all of the funding of Israel right now is in direct conflict of the agreement, the international agreements, because you're not allowed by these international agreements to fund nuclear powers that don't disclose and are not subject to inspections. We know that Israel is illegally operating a nuclear program with no inspections and in complete violation of all of the agreements that I'm going to discuss when we understand a little bit more about the proof of weapons nuclear side. So what do you think other countries are going to think when you're saying Iran's not allowed to expand its nuclear, Israel is, and it's in violation of all the agreements between the superpowers and the security network between Russia, America, France, UK, China, and also add Germany to that as well. This is why upholding international law is important, because it can't be one rule for the people that we're saying are the good guys, another rule for the people that we're saying are the bad guys, and then you hear that these people think exactly the same. This is why it is very dangerous when we don't uphold these types of things. So how did we actually get here? So now I'm going to go through some of the different trends. Let me get some of my notes here on the nuclear proof of weapons network. So the story goes something as follows. So let's go back to World War II. World War II, we had Germany and America that were in a weapons of mass destruction race. Germany wanted to invent the weapon of mass destruction before America. America wanted to try and create it. America wasn't being blown up, so it was engaging in trying to create a weapons of mass destruction. And it ended World War II by blowing up 200,000 people in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Japan. That was the most brutal thing the world has ever seen. Obviously, some of these chemical weapons were used in the Vietnam War. And if you've been to Vietnam and you go to some of those heartbreaking, when you see what happens as a result of these people, as they've got these incredible burns and, these people that have just been absolutely destroyed. They're still on the streets in Vietnam. I saw there, when I was in Vietnam, you see these people that are just, one leg and they've been burned and they're still suffering as a result of these weapons of mass destruction that America fired. Firstly, there was the Japan one, and then was some of the chemical warfare that happened. But anyway, that brings us to 1945. The atrocities happened, and the world says we need to have some kind of new world order. And the New World Order was negotiated in United Nations. United Nations set up a Security Council, and that Security Council decided that we believe, because we were the winners of the war, US, UK, Russia, France, China later, and Germany are the people that are going to be able to have these decide who gets nuclear programs. The purpose of nuclear is that now America has invented it. If you have other people that also have them, then it's meant to be detractive, where rather than having it where we start having conflict between countries, if we know that certain countries have them and they can create the end of the world as we know it today, it should prevent wars is kind of the idea. Once you've invented it, You can't let you can't uninvent it, just like Bitcoin. Once the world's largest proof of work network and largest supercomputer in the world was out there, global, and couldn't be shut down, you can't let the genie out of the box. And that is essentially what happened with these nuclear programs. But they are meant to control who gets the technology and who gets the weapons. And so the United Nations Security Council, which vetoed recently, by America vetoing against genocide and allow Israel to continue that, basically has the power, and that's the New World Order that was essentially set up. And so as these new nuclear weapons, America and the Security Council decide who gets them, different types of organizations were set up to decide who's the good guys, who's the who's the bad people, and who's allowed to acquire this different technology. Looking at my notes, I forget all these different organizations, but groups such as the Nuclear Suppliers Group, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was an agreement that was set up, the International Atomic Energy Agency, but these are essentially proxies of the West, just like the International Monetary Fund is there to get dollar debts into third world countries so that they can print the dollars that gets hyperinflates other people's currency as they try to keep their dollar reserves and inflate their own currencies in order to pay down the debt and the dollars, and the money ends up back in America. Basically, you have these proxies with that as well, based around the New World Order. Well, in the late 1960s, they decided that it was time to let more people through. So there was a meeting in 1953 in the United Nations meeting. Who was the president at the time? Eisenhower. Just looking at some of the notes, I don't remember all of the different people, but he gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly. And essentially, America was essentially through these different proxy organizations and the Security Council, they were going to allow other countries to develop their own different types of nuclears and acquire nuclear weapons. So they decided that it was the Soviet Union, it was Britain, and Russia is now the largest behind America, who's second in terms of nuclear weapons. They allowed Britain to do it. They allowed France to do it. And in 1967, a bit of the history lesson, the US basically supplied 5 different countries with and allowed them to do it. And one of those was Iran. So that brings us to kind of a little bit of the background. So Iran at the time, they had to go over to these different countries. They had to go over to MIT, and they went over through different tests. They would start building. And in 1967, it did its first test. And then we had other countries that set up their tests, just to go through some of the history. The beneficial countries essentially were Israel, where it was never agreed that they're allowed to do it, but they just started doing it. India and Pakistan and Iran, they all started building out their military programs. And then if you reneged on that agreement, then the punishment was financial sanctions. And so we start to have these sanctions programs where they say you can have this amount, you can have this amount, depending on whether you meet the rules of the Proof-of-Weapons Network. We get to decide which countries get to do it. We pick the good guys, we can pick the bad guys. And essentially, we have these nuclear programs as we see it today. Now, China and India were in a world war at the time. India started doing its first testing around 1974, after China had done its first testing in response to its war. I think China was in 1964. So because India and China were in a war at the time, India starts testing its military program. And then in response to India having it, Pakistan then started having its own type of nuclear program. And so you end up with these nuclear powers that are printing money through their central banks that are basically having tied loans to the IMF. So America would print the money through its Proof-of-Weapons Network. People would buy and lend money through bonds to the central bank. IMF would take those dollar debt. then it would tie to you can have a nuclear program as long as you spend money back in our country in dollars, borrowed dollars, and then you get to invest it and the money comes back to America, and then you print and destroy your own currency as you devalue your own currency because you have dollar debt every single month. And as long as people will buy American bonds, the whole system is propped up. And then China starts to do its first experiment in 1964, India in 1967. And then essentially round about 2000, 2003, Israel decides we've got our illegal military program. America has funded the whole thing. We're not getting inspections, but we certainly don't want anyone else in the Middle East in order to have any kind of power because of the Palestinian cause and all the things that were happening there. So America backs Israel and breaches their agreement, but then decides, America says Iran's not allowed to do it. So we have this destabilizing effect that I've covered in previous broadcasts, where you had the Iraqi war. Already America knew that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction because it already had a dismantlement program that was already happening. But Netanyahu decides to say, well, America, you go to war in Iraq, and that destabilizes between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are the big oil producers, and therefore Israel can have its illegal program and it continued to expand its settler colonialism. And then you had these different groups that were set up where Iran had its groups in Syria, Yemen, America intervened, Saudi Arabia started to intervene. And you need to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the oil powers in the Middle East. But Israel doesn't want it to do that. And so America decides that it picks its side. It picks Saudi Arabia, Israel, destabilize, sidesteps Iran, as I've covered in many other things, and then starts sanctioning and negotiating with Iran at the same time. What are the negotiations? And so, you know, the Iran negotiations, they say, we'll sanction you and cripple your economy. We'll allow Israel to have an illegal military program. We'll fund it, and then we'll normalize with Saudi Arabia and create a corridor. And then Netanyahu stands up in the United Nations and puts up a map saying the new vision of the Middle East that has no Palestine on the map. And they continue to basically expel Palestine and continue the war with countries on its borders. And then we end up where we are right now. And so remember, the deal was signed with Iran, and it had the nuclear deal that we've covered. I don't want to go too deep into it, but essentially it was a deal that was signed between America. It said, we'll inspect all of your different types of nuclear programs. We won't sanction you. And as we de-sanction you, we'll actually make up for compensation for the sanctions that have been inflicted upon you in the past. And we had the Iranian nuclear deal basically signed. Prior to that, just to go through a little bit more of the history before we end it and go over to the webinar where we can do questions and then tie it together to where we are right now with the Proof of Work Network, Proof of Weapons Network, and Proof of Stake Network. In Iran, they had their own revolution in 1979. This was used in order to kind of say that Iran, we don't like what you're doing. We think it's a little bit too unstable. Saudi Arabia is kind of a more stable kingdom. And so they listen to Netanyahu. Netanyahu gets to say, you got to go hard on Iran, sidestep Iran. Basically, US decided to pick its side, which destabilized the industry and the region, and then brings us to where we are today. And so they implemented a massive sanctioning program. The problem is that the sanctioning program in Iran still allowed it to be a power, and it took it in the other direction. It decided, I don't even care about these rules anymore. So they started expanding further and further and further. And then you had these proxy wars that were sorts that led to the greatest, worst humanitarian crises that you've ever seen as a result of the Iraq war. And then you had terrorist groups like ISIS forming that we've covered in previous broadcasts. They started fighting against Iran. and then the resistance movement that formed against the humanitarian crisis that were perpetrated, as a result of these Israel, Saudi Arabia, and American alliances. They started creating their resistance movements, and then you had Hezbollah, everything we're discussing right now, Houthis that figured out their version of sanctions, which was to get in the way of trade routes. And so they had these important trade routes. And then we have this friction that we are experiencing, that we are going through right now, that we are led to believe that if you believe in US propaganda, started with between Russia and Ukraine in 2022, none of Putin's history happened. And if you believe what we were told, this all started on October the 7th, 2023. And there was no history. It was just an unprovoked terrorist attack. And then the world started to figure out the truth that we've all been lied to. We have all our own propaganda, and we end up where we are today. So this brings us together into our understanding of all the macro, geopolitical, and Bitcoin news coming together into the current environment that you need to build and protect your wealth from. So just making sure I haven't missed anything from the notes. We had those programs. Always write a little bit too much notes. Yeah, managed to cover all of that. Boom, boom, boom. Boo, boo, boo. We've covered all of the, obviously, Trump, when he came in, he decided to breach the agreement. That led to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, which destabilized further. And that was kicked off various other retaliations. And then you have basically 150 different military industrial complexes by America, the region wanting them to leave. And then you have the tit for tat that we're experiencing right now, and all these different things that we're led to believe have no connection. There's nothing behind them other than just point blank, pointless terrorism groups that we need to just get rid of, that has nothing to do with anything that the West is actually doing. Okay. Just while I'm doing that, do me a favor, hit the like button if you like this, and subscribe to my channel. And hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all. And what's going to happen as a result of that is that you're going to get notifications every time we go live, and you're going to help me get this message out to more people so that we can try and actually get two-sided narratives, and we can build and protect our wealth and bring it back down to the micro. Right. Yeah. So that brings us to bringing this all together. So Putin's sharing his story of events. We understand what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. We know the narrative that we've been fed in the West. We are getting some of the narrative that they believe in the East. The same with the Middle East. And then next, we're obviously going to get the narratives that we're going to get, and I'll cover in future episodes, between China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and reunification, which comes into the other budget. But in the end, what happens were some of the important macroeconomic things that we covered in the beginning of this. Different trade routes and central bank digital currencies are going to be created as a result. And we're going to end up in this multipolar central bank digital currency world, with AI technology doing more and more of what humans are doing badly. And we start to progress, and we have the proof of work network as Bitcoin that is eating more and more and more of the proof of weapons network, as we start to track those, and we start to see this Bitcoin go over $1 trillion network is where we're headed, into $164 trillion network of the proof of weapons network, as it transitions over to CBDCs, where you have full reserve banking and a deleveraging and stable coins that eat away at banking. And then the cut of the transaction fees on the proof of stake network is able to be used by people that are benefiting from those transaction fees, as we deleverage away from a debt-based Ponzi scheme and we transition in between. So you need to stay up to date with it. And just so you know, for the last 3 years, I've also been putting together my whole book on following the money, where I've been tracking all the money in these different networks and helping you have an historical perspective with all the rules that I've used over the years to protect myself in these transitions. If you would like to get a free digital copy of my book, as I said, go to simondixon.com, get your login details, and you can actually get a copy of my previous book. And by the end of this year, I'm hoping to get my next book out, which goes through all of the different transitions in the Bitcoin and CBDC world. And so make sure you do that. And that is everything that I'm going to be covering for today. So just as a recap, we did the macro on the Bitcoin side. We did the updates on this week in Bitcoin, how they all relate together. We covered the macro side with China taking center news. We covered some of the geopolitical that led to some of the nuclear agreements, and we covered a little bit of the history. And that's going to be everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 20. Now, as I said, just before I close, we're going to be doing a little experiment right now. And in this experiment, if you have a login over at simondixon.com, you will get an email very shortly as we go live. And if you'd like to ask me any questions, we're going to be using the live chat. 200 people can join us. This is the first time we've done it, so it's going to be a little bit experimental, but we've done it in other membership sites that we run, and they started really, really getting people within the first few seconds. All 200 were taken. So if you have a login at simondixon.com, you will receive an email shortly. And we're going to head over to there. This is where you can create your login. It will send you a link, and you can jump onto that link, and you can ask me any questions. And we're going to try a little bit of an interactive session, and we'll see how it goes. All right. So always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Some are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. And I want to make sure that I'm giving you the geeky information and then also the simple information to stay on the right side of this change. If I have my way, we'll do it with peace, love, and unity. But the Proof-of-Weapons Network is not very conducive. So let's eat away at the Proof-of-Weapons Network with the Proof-of-Work Network. And hopefully we can do it the way that I'd love to do it. So I will see you over at the live webinar on the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal. Peace.